Today we're playing with magnets and modularity to get the most out of any piece of scatter terrain, including a change of seasons.
Hi guys, I'm Seb and I make stuff, and this week we are making the fountain of endless possibilities. The idea here is to build some basic fountains that you could find in any city or town environment and have some magnets in there so we can swap out the statues for different environments. We can swap them out for fountains that we can turn on and off, giving some water flow. We can then transform these into garden beds that'll have different seasonal options or just different colors depending on the situation you want to put in front of your players. Then the garden beds can also match with statues, giving us even more varieties that we can all swap around and have just an endless variety of different uses for the one piece of scatter terrain. This is basically the most multi-use, versatile piece of scatter terrain that I have ever built, and I just want to keep expanding on its possibilities. The main element for this build will be 4mm craft foam. You can get this at pretty much any office supply shop or craft supplies, and it's a very fundamental piece of crafting material used in a lot of the base building blocks for a whole lot of different builds I've done in the past, and probably a whole lot I'll be using in the future.
I'm then using a compass to measure out a perfect circle, and repeating this 3 times. Essentially, I'm marking out our walls and our base piece for our round fountain. If you don't have a compass, you can pick them up pretty cheap, or you could just use any circular items to make sure that all 3 of these match. Now I'm going to grab out a Stanley knife and start cutting these out. You could probably get a cleaner cut with a scalpel, but this is what I had on hand. So taking my time, as these are very sharp knives and very specific cuts, I went around chopping all of our internal circles first and then our external circles. I find this a little bit easier to try and not break the overall finished result, although by the end of this I did end up breaking one of these. Not that it is the biggest deal, as we're going to glue them all together and some broken bricks is never a bad look. Now we have our foam ring. We repeat that on our last piece, leaving us with 3 layers. We have our base and then our 2 layers high for the walls. I'm going to pile all these up and carve in some bricks. I did accidentally break one of these wall pieces, but that's fine. Once we glue it all down, it'll all match together. I'm staggering the way that the bricks sit so it looks a little bit more random than a perfect cut the whole way up our fountain. And I'm going to grab out a hot glue gun and just start gluing these in place. I probably didn't need to use as much hot glue as I did, as this ended up causing a little bit of issues later on, but nothing that I couldn't deal with. I then grabbed out our compass again and used the pointy end to widen out a few of our brick details. And now hold on to those central circles that you cut out and you'll see why later on. I then cut a scrap of foam down to an even smaller circle, which I glued down in the center of our fountain. This is going to be a spot for some statues to sit, but as I want this to be as multi-use as possible, I use the hot end of a hot glue gun to melt a little hole and glue a magnet in place. This will allow me to swap out our statues later on and give us as much reusability out of this build as possible. And now we repeat the entire process, but this time on a slightly different shape, as I want a couple of different fountains for different areas of my game. This one is actually going to give me a lot more reusability, as it has a flat back that I can put a wall piece against. So we carved some brick patterns into that, and we've got a nice little extra piece that we can use to magnetize onto that fountain, giving us another different variation of ways that we can use it. These tiny neodymium magnets come in really handy for this kind of build, and really for any kind of modular, interchangeable build that you want to make yourself. They're fairly inexpensive and you can get them in all different sizes. Once I have mine lined up, I put an extra magnet or 2 on top and just press the other piece against it to line up that height perfectly. Then we melt the holes in again with the hot end from the hot glue gun and fill them with magnets, nice and flush. Leaving us with a removable back wall for this fountain. I put a bit too much hot glue on the base of this fountain to make sure everything would stay watertight, but what was left exposed with foam, I carved a few brick patterns in, so we'd have a little bit of something extra poking through in the water. Once this was all done, I gave the entire thing a coat in a Mod Podge and black paint mix. This comes out to be a nice grey, but will dry and seal up our entire model so that any spray paints you might want to use won't destroy the foam, but also giving it just a nice harder edge.
So these have had a night to dry and they've come out looking nice and dark. At this point you could give them a dry brush in a grey if you wanted a stone look, but I want to match them up to what I built for the rest of my mazes with those other garden beds. So in this particular case, I'm going to mix it up just a little bit and use a Karak stone from Citadel rather than whatever combination it was that I used last time, since I don't remember and I can't be bothered going back to my old videos.
So we're going to just give them a heavy coat in the Karak stone, which is a colour that I do really like as it dries nice and matte. You don't have to be super heavy with this, as any gaps just are left with a nice shadow from that undertone of the dark grey. There were a few spots that I went through and had to carve out our details again, as a bit of hot glue or too much paint had sort of started to obscure them. This isn't a necessary step, but I like to see those details poking through. So while that had a chance to dry, I actually ended up making another attachable piece for the back of this flat one that would allow me to put some of those statues that I've got for my other piece. Having these interchangeable just gives me more and more different variety and use out of this build, and that is exactly what I'm going for. And now we're going to bring out some more of the details and dirty these up by giving them a heavy coat in an Agrax earth shade and then wiping off the excess. This will allow it to settle into all the crevices and details and really help them pop. If you don't want to use the expensive Citadel washes, I actually have a video on how to make your own cheaper washes. But I've already spent the money, so I'm going to use them. So this is what I kind of want these to match. I do want them to be a little bit dirtier, but to get that same effect, I'm going to dry brush them with a Ushabti bone to get a really nice sandstone look. By wiping off most of the paint and just leaving a little bit on the brush and lightly running them over this, it picks up all of the highlights, leaving those base colors down the bottom, but really helping the stones to pop and bring out all those extra details of the foam. Dry brushing has to be one of the most satisfying parts of a terrain build, as it really makes everything come to life.
All of this could be done with much cheaper acrylic paints, but since I have all of these Citadel and model paints in front of me, I'm just going to use these. Now we're going to move on to our statues. As we want these to be as multi-use as possible, I want a whole heap of different statues that I can swap out. So for this, I'm going to be 3D printing. All of these 3D prints are free over on Thingiverse, and I'll have the links in the description.
I've painted these up using a whole heap of different techniques that I'm actually going to show off in a video that I release soon, where I go through as many different types of painting statues that I can think of in the most simple ways. But basically most of them got a heavy coat in a Space Wolf's grey contrast paint and a grey dry brush later on. Now it's time to add some magnets to the bottom.
If we want to add magnets, we want to make sure we put them on the right way, as if we get the polarity wrong, it's not only not going to stick, it's going to push them away. So across the board, realistically, we want to try and make sure that all of our magnets in base pieces are in the same polarity, and all of our extra bits of scatter that have magnets on them are the opposite. That way we can move between different pieces of terrain and always make sure that these pieces are going to stick together and be as multi-use across different pieces as possible. For this, we're going to build a magic stick. I don't remember exactly where I saw this in the past, but it has been used by a lot of other creators. The idea is to grab either maybe a chopstick or a piece of wooden dowel or just something like this, and glue the magnets on either side on opposite polarity and mark them with a north and south. I don't have a generic north and south, but if we do make a decision for ourselves and make sure that each sides are opposites, we keep that the same universal standard across all of our builds, and everything should work nicely together. So I'm going to grab out a couple of cheap neodymium magnets that match the size of the piece of wood that I am going with and glue them to either side, sticking to the same polarity that I've used in my build, so I can use this as my measuring stick for everything going forward to make sure that all of our scatter stays upright. Now that we have our stick ready to go with opposite polar ends, I'm going to paint the opposite ends, one representing my north, one representing my south, so that I can always make sure that every piece of terrain I make going forward has the same polarity. So now whenever I take a piece of terrain, I can make sure that this is our ground side and this is our north.
Now to help me remember, I'm picking a couple of bright colours to represent each side.
So I've marked my stick out as yellow for north and red for south. I've also gone through and added a heap of little N's on one side and S on the other, just to make sure that every time I come back to this, I can remember which is my north and south side for my magic stick. Now I'm going to make sure to keep this handy and use it in every single build with magnets that I do going forward to keep everything as universal and cross-compatible as possible.
So we've used that now to make sure that we glue these magnets onto our statues the right way, and we start sticking those magnets to the base.
I know not everyone has access to a 3D printer, but you could repeat all of these processes on some old cheap toys or even some minis that you don't need for your table. In fact, I'm going to use an old How to Train Your Dragon toy to make a backing piece that'll go on that wall behind our flat-backed fountain.
I want a mounted dragon head that can be spitting out water. So I'm going to grab my handsaw and just start chopping into this plastic. And it was more difficult than I expected, but I got there in the end. Then I'm going to take this piece right here, which is actually from a failed 3D print. You could cut this out of foam or cardboard, but since I have the perfect piece, I'm going to use it as my backing. So I just add a little bit of glue and stick down one of those neodymium magnets. Then I'm going to glue the head onto our backboard, and then using a larger magnet, I can just set this behind our wall and it will hold this statue head in place. That'll get the same basic paint treatment as our other bits and pieces, with a prime, a Citadel Wraithbone white coat, and then a heavy coat with our Space Wolves grey. All of the statues that had a grey base with that Space Wolves grey got a quick dry brush with a really bright grey, just to help bring out all of those highlights on these grey statues. I also hit one of these dragons that just had a basic cheap spray undercoat with the same grey to give us a more cheap and easy option and show you what you can do even without a 3D printer. Leaving us with a really good wide selection of statues that we can throw down on our builds. This is the kind of modularity that I want from this kind of terrain because it really does make it as widely reusable as possible for a whole heap of different encounters and environments. In addition, all of these magnetized statues can now be put on other pieces of terrain wherever we want.
Okay, all of our base builds are done, our statues are ready to go, now it's time to fill in our fountains. For this part, I want to paint a little bit of a base onto them to help give a bit more, color or depth to the fountains themselves, and then I'm going to fill them up with 2-part epoxy. You could use clear glues and go layer by layer, allowing them to dry, but you have to do very thin layers and they take quite a bit of time to dry. So while you could get this done with, say, PVA glue, that would take far too long for what I am trying to do. So what I'm going to use is some cheap 2-part epoxy that I got from a local Kmart. I got this for about $5 as a part of a jewelry making kit or something that they've got going on. It's only a very small amount, but it's going to be more than enough for what we have here. So I'm going to start, like I said, by painting up the bases a little bit, adding in maybe a few bits of glitter to represent coins that may have been tossed in by passers-by as they made a wish, and then filling the entire thing up with that clear resin to represent our water. So let's start by painting up the bases and adding in those little flecks of gold and silver glitter to represent our wish coins.
To give some colour to the base, I started off with a blue ink, and very quickly realised that I didn't like it. So luckily this stays wet long enough that I could wipe all that away and come in with a dark green. This was much more in line with the sort of look you'd expect to see at the bottom of an old fountain. Then to add in those wish coins, I grabbed out some glitter. Now be warned, if you don't already know, glitter spills very easily and is hard to get rid of, so be careful. I then grabbed out some gloss Mod Podge and put a thin layer over the bottom of both of our fountains, and then sprinkled in some bits of silver and gold glitter. Somewhere I do have some copper glitter, which would have been nice to add some cheaper coins, but I couldn't find them, so this will have to do. Realistically, the glitter coins are really not necessary, but I want this to be used for a big Feywild magic style encounter, so I wanted to add a little bit of something extra. Now, as I mentioned, this stuff spills very easily, so I took a good amount of time going around and making sure that I cleaned all of it up, so it won't be accidentally showing up in every craft project going forward. I really hope I got it all. And now it's time to pour the resin. And since I always get this comment, I think it's about time I start wearing some gloves. I'm taking this 2-part epoxy resin and mixing it up with a little bit of blue ink. I put way too many drops and this came out way too dark. I didn't really pay enough attention as I was doing it, so I ended up pouring this out into both of our fountains. Then deciding it needed a little more detail, so I threw in a tiny little resin printed turtle. This was when I realized I didn't like the super dark blue, so I poured that out and mixed up some more resin, this time only adding in a single drop of a blue. This was a much better result. It was maybe a little bit too clear this time. I'm still getting used to this combination, so I added a tiny bit more of the original back in to bring a bit more blue into the overall pattern. Then I cleaned up the edges where I poured out the resin before and left it all to dry.
Okay, those have had a couple of days to dry, a little bit longer than I would have originally left them for, but I got distracted on my bendy hedges build. But now we have some really nice clear water effects on both of our fountains. Now we need to make them a little bit more rough. You could leave these exactly as they are, but I want to make them a little bit more ripply and like the water's moving around. So I'm going to grab out some gloss Mod Podge and put a little bit of a ripple layer on top and let that dry nice and clear. You want to make sure you're using the gloss Mod Podge for this one, as if you use the matte, you won't get that correct glossy water look. So we're going to bust this out, put a few layers down and try and make it look nice and rippled.
So I get a good chunk of the Mod Podge and just start spreading a thin layer over top of our resin. I try and make sure this is as dappled as possible to give us as much variation to the water top as possible. This took about a night to dry, and this is what we're left with. You can already see a lot more patterning to the top of the water there, but I did come in and give it a couple more layers to just put some more detail and ripples onto our water, particularly around the turtle to give us the illusion of movement.
So these fountains are starting to look really cool, especially with some of these interchangeable statues. And a couple of them have the options where we could actually make a working fountain pour out some water. So let's start building some more modularity so we can turn our fountains on and off.
For this, I'm going to grab some cheap craft wire, which will bend into shape to make a kind of armature for our water flow. Now we're going to take some small neodymium magnets and glue them into the areas of our fountains that we want the water to be able to come out of, and glue a reverse polarity magnet onto the end of our armature. Once we make sure that's the right size, we'll paint the base with a light blue and let that dry. In the meantime, we're going to cover up that magnet with a little bit of grey primer and wash, then grab out the hot glue gun and just start covering up that armature with some clear hot glue. You want this to look nice and random, so it gives that rippled water look. Now I'm going to grab out some hobby fill fluff that I've got and glue this onto the end to give us a bit more of a wash splash kind of effect, so that once we have our pieces stuck together, it looks like the water is flowing out of our statue and splashing up around the fountain base. Now you have some choice for what you want to play down in game, or possibly have your players able to turn the fountains on and off. We could then take this piece and add it to our other fountain. It's a little bit off on the size, but it'll work just fine. I also decided to use our other dragon head and add the same system into him so we can turn the water on or off from our dragon's mouth, giving us a huge amount of possibilities for our fountains. But we're not done yet.
Since our circular fountain has got so many options of modularity, I thought we had to make a few more options for the back wall of our flatback fountain.
So I went to my Warhammer bits box and grabbed some of the old Lizard Man bits and pieces that I had left over from some old Warhammer. I then painted this up and glued a magnet to the back, giving us another option to swap out on that back wall.
All of our fountains are looking awesome, but we want to make them even more modular by having the ability to transform them into raised garden beds.
We'll be using those extra pieces that we cut out of the middle and kept earlier to pattern out a piece of scrap cardboard. This should match pretty well perfectly, but we are going to have to make some tweaks. So we'll trace it out, cut it all down to size, and then slowly modify this till it fits perfectly inside of our fountains. You can make as many of these as you like, and they're going to be a perfect insert that can be easily removed to bring you back and forth between two styles of builds. Next, I'm going to take some Tamiya soil effects and really give these guys a heavy coat, giving them that nice earthen base. And once that's dry, we start planting out our garden with a whole heap of grass tufts and flowers. A lot of these have sticky bases, but I like to use super glue just to make sure everything holds on nice and tight. Then you just start laying out the flowers however you see fit. And I like to add in a little something extra as our centerpiece. Now we move on to the other fountains piece, mixing up the colors from the last one just to give us a little bit more range. And now for the step that I can't miss, adding in some frogs and little critters for that little tiny extra bit of detail once it's down on the game board. Now, since these were removable, I decided to make a few more variations, this time adding a magnet into the center so we can add some more variation to the garden. For this, I'm going to cut a tiny circle out of that same cardboard we used earlier, glue a small magnet down, and then coat this in that same texture paste we used earlier. Once that's dry, I'm going to glue down some more of those tufts and flowers, giving us a magnetized tiny little flower piece that we can swap out in the center of our gardens, giving us the option to change up the flowers or even put a statue in the center of the garden bed. Then I thought, what if we want it to be a different season and have no flowers at all? So I made a dead version of the garden. This could be used in-game to bring the flowers to life right in front of your player's eyes. All of these inserts can also just be played down on the table as their own scatter terrain.
And so we have our Fountains of Endless Possibility, a piece of scatter that we can swap out the statues for different environments. We can replace the statues with a working fountain that can switch on and off. We can completely remove the statues and fountain and turn them into a garden bed that we can change the color of the flowers, whether the flowers are grown or dead, depending on the season that your players are interacting with this environment. Honestly, the more pieces we build, the more variety we could get out of these, and it could just be endless. And all this for a very minimal amount of storage that can be playable across a whole heap of different environments. Not only can you make these super modular in a way that helps you to use them in a heap of different situations, but if you're playing a tabletop RPG game, you could actually have your players interact with the environment. Maybe they can find a way to switch the fountain on or off, causing some kind of effect. Maybe by casting a spell, they can have the flowers grow on the garden bed. Actually giving them the ability to change the environment in front of them can really help unnerve some players into the game, and it can be a really fun way for a DM to add a few puzzles to the table. Having all of these possibilities is a lot of fun to me, and has really got my mind racing, coming up with a whole heap of different ways that I could use these modular magnetic pieces. If you've got any ideas of how you would use them or what you'd like to see me do with this system in the future, please let me know below, because I'm sure that everyone out there is going to come up with a whole heap of things that just never crossed my mind. And I love the idea that we can build out and improve these kind of things as a community for everyone to enjoy at their table. I hope you guys have found something that you can use or that you like in this build, and until next time, never stop making stuff.